thing that you get is, sitting where we are in 2022 is how much things come round again. Analog synths are popular again, vinyl's popular again. In certain countries, we're seeing a lot of young kids, 20 years, 25, who are just getting into the music, maybe because of their parents or whatever. So how much the whole thing goes in cycles, and how much at the moment it does feel curiously a lot like the early days. That's the thing for me, is you see these cycles come and go, and, circles keep completing and then moving on.
What up, it's Mr. X to the Z Exhibit.
What's up, guys? It's Andy Frisella.
This is your boy Foul Monk.
This is Ryan Serhant.
This is Shingy.
Hi, it's Patrick McDivitt.
This is Sonia Servitani.
This is Director X.
Hey everybody, I'm Forbes Riley.
Yo, this is Goldie.
This is Amberly Lago.
This is Chris Voss.
Michael Francis here.
Yo, this is Charlie Tuna.
Hey, what's up? It's Billy G.
And you're listening to the Run GpG
podcast.
Well, I'm going to go hang out and listen to David's next podcast from the Run GpG.
You might hear something you like. Peace.
Originally formed in 1982 and led by Bon Harris and Douglas McCarthy, Nitzer Ebb is a British electronic industrial EDM group that has been making music and playing to global audiences for the last 4 decades. Known for the unique and aggressive industrial dance sound as well as their explosive live performances, the group is once again reunited for a number of shows over the past couple of years and are looking forward to playing a limited number of dates and shows in Europe along with Front 242 in the new year. Bon, Douglas, welcome to the Run GpG podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah, excited to have you guys. And as I was telling you, this one's personal for me in a lot of ways because I did grow up with Nitzer Ebb music. I still listen to it. I go to the shows. I see the group's influence on new music today. I do. And as mentioned in the intro there, 4 decades of music, albums, and touring, 40 years. Now, when I say that, when you're asked about it in interviews, what's the first thing that comes to mind when you're reminded that you've been making music or been involved with Nitzer Ebb for 40 years?
How much had backache?
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny actually because there's quite obviously with the advent of the internet, there's a lot of stuff that gets trolled up that you've kind of forgotten about. And I was a friend of ours was she's playing in Amsterdam, and as part of this join the forces to the Nitzer Ebb Front 242 tour in January in Europe, we play at the Paradiso. And I mentioned it to her that the first time we were in Amsterdam to play, it was at the Paradiso. And then she asked when it was, and I, couldn't remember, but then looked up. I knew that we'd played a gig with Bad Brains, and that was, I think it was like 85. And there's a recording actually of David Gooday, who was still in the band at that time, singing Alarm, which is the song that we've got him singing on stage throughout the shows this year and probably next year as well. And it sounds exactly the same. So, as an analogy of how things change but don't change, I guess that's about it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is that, that the thing that you get is, sitting where we are in 2022 is how much things come round again. Analog synths are popular again, vinyl's popular again. People, in certain countries, we're seeing a lot of young kids, 20 years, 25, who are just getting into the music, maybe because of their parents or whatever. So how much the whole thing goes in cycles, and how much at the moment it does feel curiously a lot like the early days, So so that's the thing for me is you see these cycles come and go, and circles keep completing and then moving on.
Well, and I think one of the things I was talking about with we were talking about Kevin, as David said, but one of the things that came up when I was chatting with Kevin on Sunday was the amount of bands that are still around, of what he kind of considers to be a kind of golden era. And we're all still out there. I mean, to one degree or another, some have gone into other outfits, but it is pretty much all of the older bands from that period. And I made the comparison to skaters. You know, we used to skateboard and we're friends with a few of the older skaters, pro skaters of that time. And none of them stop. I mean, they don't have to keep going, but they do it because they love it. And I think that if we weren't enjoying it, I guess 40 years would have been a bit arduous, but it's,
well, listen, you guys look fantastic.
Thank you.
1985, you just referenced 1985. And I don't know if you know this, Bon. I don't know if you know this, but the first show you played in North America was in Montreal, according to Douglas.
Yeah.
Yes. Correct.
Yeah. Au Garage was the club.
Yeah.
Don't know it.
No, I mean, I guess it's gone about 35 years ago.
That was a fairly pivotal gig in getting us signed to Geffen. There was a little bit of a mini label war going on at the time, and several execs came to that show to witness the magic for themselves.
Well, was it? Yeah, and it was magic. Well, again, shout out to Canada for being involved there. Kevin Key, fellow Canadian as well. It's very interesting. But listen, let's. You know, in the time we have, I do want to go back to the beginning, because you don't get a lot of opportunities to talk to Nitzer Ebb about, you know, the early days, originally from Essex, I believe, correct? Essex?
Correct.
Yeah. Tell us how and why the group formed, and maybe just describe the early days for us. Like, what was the genesis of the group?
We all skateboarded together as kids in high school, or the core of the band did. And, you know, through that interest in skateboarding, obviously we got turned on to music. And, you know, skating at the time was sort of split between old style rock and roll, but a lot of new wave and sort of getting into electronic music. Devo were a big influence on skating music. So sort of we were getting turned on to electronics through that. And, you know, and we gradually migrated from skating with music side to being more focused on music with skating on the side. And kind of developed from there. And also, you know, the town we're from, Chelmsford, back then was, you know, it's quite a sleepy little town. It was, you know, down the train line from London. It was a suburb in some respects, but it was also still really rural in a lot of it. And there just wasn't much to do. And we were always quite energetic and creatively minded. So we were always, you know, for things to do to keep ourselves occupied and to channel the energy that we had. So, you know, eventually starting a band seemed like the logical next thing, given our interest in music.
Throughout the UK, there used to be a movie theatre group called the Odeon. And so bands, it was kind of a throwback to might be even the 60s, certainly the entire 70s. Then bands would do an Odeon tour, and it meant that they'd do a package with Odeon, and then they would play Odeon cinemas across the country and get to more of these kind of, you know, out of the way places. And the Chelmsford Odeon was actually quite a big theatre. So bands like Susan the Banshees, we went to see them on their on the Juju tour in 81, Adam and the Ants, similar kind of time period, 1980. So we, you know, the band, and because, as Bond said, we were like 25 minutes from central London. So we would go and see bands like Bauhaus, The Birthday Party in London. And it was actually a lot of the opening acts as well, you know, like when we saw Bauhaus, when we saw a Birthday Party at the Lyceum, it was the first time that Einsender Neubauten had played in the UK. And we had a really good record store in the town. So as young teenagers, you know, like sort of 13 years old, 14 years old, we'd go down to the record store and just couldn't really afford to buy that much, but we would play a lot of music and had a good collection of European sort of, you know, stuff like Deutsche Amerikanische Freundschaft and Palais Schaumburg and Die Krupps. And so we were able to listen to stuff that, although it was a small kind of tucked away town, there was a lot, if you had a mind to do it, as Bond said, you know, which we were excited to get as much experience in life as possible. And music seemed to be just an obvious step to make once we'd been listening to it for a few years. And it didn't take us that long. I mean, I think the first gig we ever did there, we were like 15, 16 years old. So things started quite young out of boredom. And also, you know, another thing in the UK was licensing laws at pubs was pretty, certainly in small towns, wasn't really enforced. So we would go down the pub and drink and, like, you know, sort of live a life of what would be in North America, certainly the States would, you know, you'd have to wait until you're like 18 years old to be able to do the stuff that we were doing at the age of about 13, 14.
You know, what an era of music you just referenced there. And, you know, in preparing for this, I saw an interview that both of you did in 1990 on MTV, and Bon pretty much said the same thing, where he said, we lived in a small town with nothing to do. And then Douglas said, the easiest thing was for us to grab a cheap synthesizer, and now you have a band. So Douglas said that. Like, looking back, do you still think it was as simple as that? You know, we just had, you know, Patrick on the show, and he said the same thing. He said, we don't play any instruments, we just push buttons.
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, it was pretty prophetic at the time, because as it turns out, the rest of the world caught up by the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, and everyone's making music on a laptop or then their phone. It was essentially that, but it was a little bit more expensive and slightly harder to navigate, but essentially it was a lot easier than learning to play a guitar.
Yeah, I mean, there was just a general impatience on our part. We had that energy, and we were used to skating, where you just jump on a board and get it done. And also, we were fascinated with electronics. You know, that was an emerging sound that we'd become curious about. So the two things kind of came together, and it made sense. So...
Well, you know, you're referencing it, and it's interesting because at that time there was this emerging sound, a golden era. You referenced it earlier. It was that industrial synth drum, you know, electronic sound, EDM, whatever you want to call it. Groups like yourself, Front 242, Throbbing Gristle, Kraftwerk, but Nitzer Ebb in particular, was known for its aggressive sound, right? In fact, critics thought it might be overly aggressive for the time, considering, you know, the genre. They did. In fact, the phrase I remember reading was angst-ridden. Was a phrase I remember. Now, you were known for that cold, you know, minimalistic driving synth, you know, drums and vocals. However, that's, I think, what created your fiercely loyal fans. You know, I read an article that said the undercurrent of violence in the early days of Thatcher's Britain shaped the group. Like, do you agree with that? Or what was behind the influence of the group's, you know, aggressive sound?
Well, we were fairly, certainly Bon and myself, David Goodell was a bit more kind of imposing looking physically, but Bon and I were really small. And you know, backcombed hair and a little bit of makeup, you'd get slapped around at a bus stop if you weren't careful. So it was kind of a defense mechanism to dress up as tough looking as we could and be at least put a little bit of doubt in someone's mind before they messed with us. And that transpired into the music as well. I mean, we also actually liked the aggressiveness of punk, even if we didn't like necessarily all of the music, but things like, I mean, at the time, that another influence on us was Public Image Limited, the first Public Image Limited album. And that, you know, I mean, the song itself, Public Image, the single, was the first single. That kind of like Devil May Care attitude mixed with a good, healthy splatter of impending violence was always appealing to us. And then, you know, Killing Joke, other bands like that, even Birthday Party were incredibly violent on stage.
Yeah. And again, a lot of it goes back to the skating roots. I mean, skating was definitely an aggressive sport, you know, if you're doing vertical skateboarding and stuff like that. And when we first started getting into skateboarding, 76, 77, punk was emerging as a mainstream force. You know, for us as teenagers, that's when we were sort of making the transition from being kids to young adults. And that was our environment, was like a fairly aggressive, fairly violent social scene mixed with a sport that was high energy, had a lot of aggression. and allied with punk music as its soundtrack. So that was kind of in our DNA at that point. And, I think subsequently, when I read back on some of the comments about how angst-ridden and everything else it was what I get from it more these days, looking back, was that it was defiance. It was kind of really standing up for yourself and making a statement more than sort of trying to radiate aggression. It was more like a standing our ground and being very forthright in that we weren't going to be deterred or intimidated from what we wanted to do, and the more that people did try and deter us from it, the more defiant we got. And, that came out in music.
And then also going back to the kind of the political atmosphere at the time, there was the politics themselves were abhorrent, but it was also a very violent place in terms of police heavy-handedness. I mean, that hasn't changed that much. They've just kind of dressed it up a little bit, but notorious. Like there was a special police group, SPG, that was based in London. It was the Metropolitan Police Force, and they literally murdered people that were protesting, anti-apartment and apartheid. Sorry, not apartments. That's nice. They weren't anti-apartments.
No.
But there was an aggressiveness, and then there was through the Thatcher doctrine of politics. It was very much allowed. Everybody was allowed or encouraged to be really selfish and uncaring and flaunt whatever they had, and so it created it never really turned back from that. I don't think, but quite a selfish atmosphere throughout the country. And there was a reaction against that from us, of like, we didn't want to look like the people that were aspiring to look wealthy, good barrow boys made good, as they were.
Well, it's interesting to look back at that era. Again, I keep bringing it up, but 40 years of longevity, right? I think it was the fact that you weren't conforming, or you didn't care to make critics happy. I've heard you say that, right? You weren't doing it for the sake of popularity. Do you think that attitude lent itself to the 40 years of longevity, 4 decades of music?
Yeah, definitely. I think you mentioned a lot of the early aggression and stuff engendered such as dedicated fan base. I think we felt something and we tapped into something that a lot of other people were obviously feeling and maybe didn't have the circumstance or whatever to put a voice to it, and we did. And I think people did pick up on the fact that we weren't posturing. This wasn't a marketing scheme. This was, for us, it was probably literally life and death to get involved in a band like ours. And still, when we see young kids come into the gigs and stuff like that, there's a certain amount of raw honesty about it that I think does. We've all felt that kind of thing as well, where we discover an artist that has managed to encapsulate some vague feeling that we had. And that's why we get totally enthralled by that artist. They're like, that's it. They've nailed exactly what I was feeling so well. And that's what makes you devoted to following certain other artists,
1,000%. Like I said, I mean, to this day, I still have Nitzer Ebb on my playlist, so 40 years. Now you were, very popular, coming out of that post-punk era, industrial, that fringe element of music. But I think it was the tour with Depeche Mode that gave you some commercial attention, I guess you could say. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of the story of working or going on the road with Depeche started obviously when we signed to Mute, and we tried to sign to Mute with our producer at the time, Phil Harding, and his business partner. We started a record label called Power Voice Communication, and Daniel Miller of Mute Records contacted us and basically asked us to sign. He wanted us to tour with Depeche for the Music of the Masses tour. Initially for Europe, and we were very much set against it, partly out of inexperience of what the record industry and certainly was then for a young band like ourselves. So anyway, we acquiesced to go on the tour, and it was pretty much from the first day, Bon and I were just either front of house or side of stage watching them. That's how you do it. But obviously within the confines that it set around ourselves of that performance, but it made us realize that you could take what we were doing and make it bigger in terms of like audience size. And then when we did the Violator tour, by that time, which is a 1990 tour, then we did the tour in North America, and we'd actually, with Showtime, which was the album we were promoting at the time, we had written a few songs that had that stadium or larger venue in mind, festivals or whatever. So it was part of that evolved sound, was definitely being on the road with Depeche and like thinking about how we can move ourselves into a bigger version, like both in sound and performance.
Yeah, and we couldn't have had a better education really in making that transition from being, wanting to be absolutely underground to understanding that you have to have some kind of profile to carry on and survive.
Yes. And,
watching Depeche, it was like just a masterclass in how you can scale those kind of heights but maintain your integrity. So it was just a perfect place for us to be, to learn how to transition and what things to do to try and make a transition.
Yeah, and much like yourself, they're showmen, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, groups like, Depeche Mode, we were talking about Front 242, Nine Inch Nails, yourselves, active again, right? Making music on tour. There's a resurgence of, these influential groups from the 80s and 90s that are making a comeback again. The tours have been alarmingly popular, especially the Depeche Mode tours, like they're doing multiple dates, sold out. I went to the one here. I couldn't believe it. It was insane. Why do you think there's been this electronic music renaissance over the last few years? Like, why have they become so popular again? I think, it could be the overlap of generations like you mentioned, but off the top of your head, what do you think is behind that resurgence?
I mean, historically, in the, Detroit techno list of influential bands on people like Derek May and pretty much,
Richie Houghton, I've heard him mix your stuff.
Their influences were Kraftwerk, Depeche Mode, Nitzer Ebb, Front 242, like the influences that created techno, and then in some instances, within a city, into sort of pop dance music, and then the evolution of all of that into pretty much every music form. Country and Western can sound pretty electronic these days. And I think that initial interest that got kids in, literally the darkest parts of Detroit, making electronic music, it goes full circle, and people were beginning to maybe have a more nuanced ear than they had in terms of general public, and they can recognize it's electronic music. I like electronic music because of more of a pop reference, but this sounds pretty similar to something I'm used to, like the actual sound.
Yeah, I think also as well, in terms of things coming full circle, when we started, everyone was living in the shadow of the Cold War. There was high unemployment, high inflation, a lot of instability, and we're back there. It's in a different way that it's manifesting itself, but it's essentially the same things. We live in a fairly tense time, and I think that a lot of the music, like ourselves and Front and Nine Inch Nails, they resonate with that kind of atmosphere. People are feeling the tension. People need an outlet, and people need to let go of some of their anxieties. And I think that sort of, this kind of music resonates with that kind of climate.
Well, funny enough, someone sent me a link this morning of a news story on the BBC that the new right-wing Italian government are going to ban raves.
It's a little late. It's a little late
for that.
Yeah, because that's
criminal activity. Like last time I went to a rave, it certainly was criminal. It should have stopped that years ago.
Yeah, the golden age of raves. Fantastic breakdown. Speaking of the music, the best description of Nitzer Ebb music I've seen was a metallic and militant funk, which I thought was great. How do you describe the music?
It's interesting because, I was asked that question last night. And the thing that I find most overlooked with all this terms of aggression and everything else is the funk element. And that's something that, again, is a massive influence on us before we really got into, electronic music and post-punk music. Growing up, it was all funk and reggae and soul that we were listening to. And I think that's what sets us apart from a lot of later industrial bands that were influenced by us, is that they picked up on the sort of mechanical starkness. But I think, especially on albums like Belief, there is a kind of a warmth and organic funkiness to it that we never wanted to, I think we were powerless to not have in the music.
And then even on the first album, that Total Age, that we used to love listening to, stuff like Sylvester and Divine gay music, and that's prevalent on that album. And we've gone back to that quite often, 16-beat bass lines and straightforward, funky, but straight ahead drums. So, that's all part of.
But again, that music, Sylvester and Divine and all that kind of stuff, driving electronic music that was kind of defiant and uplifting, very much of its culture, supporting its culture and not apologizing for its culture. And, so we picked up all those influences from that scene as well,
Yeah, I do notice it's interesting. The electronic groups from the UK back then had a huge, it was a big, like almost Southern US influence. You get the blues and the reggae and the ska, a lot of ska and things like that in there. And you can pick up on it. You can, the undertones of it, right? It's there. I do want to ask you guys about the visuals, because this is something I'm obsessed with, which is design. Graphics and design have always been a big part of Nitzer Ebb and the Nitzer Ebb brand. Can you talk on the visual side? Like, what influenced the look of the brand?
Well, the aesthetics of a lot of the bands we loved, not necessarily in keeping with what we entirely used. And so we gravitated to that sort of self-identifying strength in the artwork. And then when we quite early on, pretty much because of the record store, Parrot Records, that we used to go to, we met Simon Granger, who is a designer. Working alongside Simon has been a big part of that. But Bon and myself have a strong design element. And then again, seemingly keep saying it a lot in this interview, but we loved skating deck designs, certainly some of the more artistic riders. Something that is identifiable. You kind of get an inkling of the style of the music and the style of the people involved.
Yeah, one of the the imagery from the early days is, people mentioned it was socialist looking, right? It definitely had a political look to it, right? What are your thoughts? Was that deliberate?
Yeah, it kind of reflected, a lot of what was dominating our lives. Like I say, you had the shadow of the Cold War, you had social, political things. You really couldn't get away from politics and a political statement. And also, I think we were very aware of media manipulation of messages, and that's become even more prevalent in the 21st century. Black is white, up is down. It's people aren't saying what they mean and they're inverting things. And we became fascinated with that. We were kind of fascinated with propaganda and how that worked and sort of turning images on their heads and inverting certain things and just making people ask questions, really. And
there was on the political side of things, there was, even beyond the Soviet Union, there was the Clash using the Sandinistas, and South America and South and Central America was a really scary place, and it had fascism was alive and well, and they used all of the tropes from the Nazis. And then, obviously the only reason that most of Eastern Europe became part of the Soviet Empire was because of the Nazis. Like it's all very much in Europe at that time. I mean, so you're talking about the early 80s. You're only less than this far away from World War II.
Yeah.
The kids don't know. The kids don't know.
Yeah.
They don't. They don't. And we're also like a lot of the artists that, particularly Doug and Simon were interested in, like Dada and John Hartfield and all that, like the sort of agit-prop approach that they took, that was really kind of fascinating where it wasn't necessarily obvious all the time, or it could be misconstrued. And again, we were interested in just making people think below the surface level and think things through, because if they didn't do that in their normal lives, they were going to get suckered by a lot of what they were being sold, especially by the right wing and the conservatives, an ability to stop and question what you're being served up on a plate was something we were interested in that approach,
The other thing was, bands like Cabaret Voltaire and A Certain Ratio, where there was a lot of tongue deep jokes.
Yeah, and that's, again with the funkiness that gets overlooked, I think something that does get overlooked in our music and our approach is essentially there is a sense of humor in a lot of it, an ironic sense of humor, and not everybody gets that. But again, it's a similar thing where we're like, well, it's in there if you care to look for it. And we tend to appreciate people more who do identify it, because it means that they've studied it a little bit harder and asked themselves a few more questions about it.
100%. No, I love that breakdown. And just a few more questions left to wrap up, but I do want to get your thoughts on the fact that you've had such a large influence on industrial music, electronic groups over the past, 4 decades. Still, as we talked about, many techno DJs are still mixing Nitzer Ebb into their sets, their sampling, and you can clearly see the influence on a lot of, modern industrial. I hate to keep using the word industrial, but mostly industrial groups. What does that mean to you to know that you've had that impact? Like, sometimes you don't realize that you've had such a large influence until you look back and you go, damn, we've been doing this for 4 decades now. So what does it mean to you to have that influence on not just music, but, people like myself? We talked about the visual side. It's been the web of Nitzer Ebb has gone a lot of different places over the last 4 decades.
Yeah. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think it feels like a kind of a vindication in a sense. The early days, they weren't easy. The amount of sort of press resistance, general resistance, even when we were fairly well established, like opening tours for Depeche in the US was still like, where are your guitars? There was we had to break through a lot of barriers. And at certain points in our career, it was fairly lean times and a fairly thankless task. So to see it, eventually come round where, other people have taken that on board and we've broken through a few barriers. And like Doug says, modern popular music is now made pretty much the way we were trying to make it back then, and trying to say to other people, look, this is legitimate to us. This is how we want to do it. And, we had to break through a lot of prejudice to get there, and sometimes, be on fairly short shrift to carry on. So it's it does feel good in a way to see, to be able to see there was something to what we were saying. We weren't completely delusional idiots all the time, although we did have our moments.
I feel like there's sort of there's an affinity to something that is part of a music tradition before MTV, before the sort of 80s, that bands would borrow from each other. Cover versions were a normal thing that bands did. I mean, that, jazz and blues it was like trying to hear someone do the greatest version of a song, so I was having a conversation about. So I think in some ways I feel like there's an affinity with that people it's a kind of long tradition of borrowing and experimenting with other people's ideas and then incorporating it into your own setup, which is essentially what we did. And I feel like now that, like I say, MTV, looking back, and it was a terrible idea. It's like in some ways it meant that there was lots of artists signed because they needed content, but they had a very, very particular, mandate to fulfill, and it kind of eradicated a lot of that freedom. And with although I think it still exists as a channel, one of the upsides of the internet is that you can access anything and get influenced by anything again, in the same way that you would going to a record store or just seeing bands.
Yes, that's a good point.
That's a fantastic perspective. Are you a new real estate agent or thinking about getting a real estate license? If so, you're going to want to ask about the Greater Property Group's Agent Scholarship Program. Why pay for the cost of the course yourself when the Greater Property Group will subsidize the cost for you? Make sure you reach out and get all the details on the Greater Property Group's Agent Scholarship Program. In the time we have left, guys, maybe tell us about the side projects you're both involved in. I guess they're not really side projects anymore, right? Like it's almost like Nitzer Ebb is the side project in a way.
Sometimes it feels that way. Yeah.
Right, Bon, first of all, the Lemon Tree project. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that came about, as a product of the pandemic, really. I'd been meaning to get back into singing a little bit. And then, we all got locked down, and I was fortunate enough to live in a place where I had a really nice garden. So I posted a couple of little innocuous clips of me just a cappella singing, wandering around the garden, because I wanted to show some sort of fairly bright and happy images in a fairly dark time. And I got sort of a surprising response from that. People asking if I could sing the entire song, people asking if I could do an electronic version of the song. So since the lockdown was carrying on, I thought, well, it will keep me busy to work on some cover versions. And people were starved for new things and live shows, and I thought, well, it might be nice to do something to share with other people. So I picked songs that were really important to me personally, growing up through the years, from a wide range of genres. And I also tried initially to pick songs that were very soothing or nostalgic or relaxing, because it was a dark time and I felt we had enough tension. And so I, kind of did it as a project to keep me busy and to give something back in a difficult time. And yeah, there was people took it on board like that. People were very, very appreciative of it and really got into it. So, it served a lot of purposes in one, and it's all been extremely positive and good fun. So I've been really enjoying it.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking, what a true artist. You go from the angst-ridden, cold, hard Nitzer Ebb to playing a cappella in the garden. You know, when I hear that, and I'm like,
well, I mean,
he's an artist.
And it kind of goes back to your earlier statement, like Nitzer Ebb in some ways being the side project. There's so many aspects to both Doug and I's personalities that don't necessarily fit within the template that we've created for Nitzer Ebb. But, as an artist and to continue growing, you do have to, address those other areas in some way. That's in your DNA as a creator to have a lot of different perspectives. And if something doesn't fit in the thing that you're known for and established, well, then make the space to express yourselves in as many ways as you can, even outside of music, graphics, visuals, painting, whatever. If you're a creative person, you're going to have those impulses and they're going to be wide reaching. So
I love it. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. And Douglas, you've been working with the Terence Fixmer project, among other things. Tell us about that, because I love the music. I absolutely love it.
Thanks, man. Yeah, Terence, this was at a time where I'd moved back to London, and Terence and a few other of what used to be called the French techno mafia, which was like the hacker, and they'd asked these, at that time, up and coming techno artists to do remixes. And after Terence had finished that, he got in touch with me. But anyway, and then within a week of being in the studio, we sort of wrote an album and then decided that. And so that kind of found itself almost immediately getting a lot of response. It got a label deal and started touring, Europe and then the States. Terence, quite rightly, is sort of recognized as one of the artists that really took the influence of EDM and techno, as they describe it. I've done various other projects. I've got another one based in London with a guy called Headman. We have a project called SASM, SASM, which is sort of, we've released like one track, but we got in the works an album, and that's kind of like sort of dirty funk, sort of post-punk sounding funky tracks. And then as Bon was saying about the different facets of our personalities that don't necessarily fit too perfectly with Nitzer Ebb, we've also got a side project from Nitzer Ebb called Drag, DRAG, which is done with another artist in LA, which hopefully will see the light of day some point this year. And then there was Black Line, and I did like solo project stuff. I did a solo album.
So new music is coming. Nitzer Ebb music is coming.
There is Drag.
Well, I'm calling it new Nitzer Ebb music.
Yeah, but then there's some conversations about something later in the year.
Let's go.
You know, we've got so much sort of music that we've done outside of the Ebb waiting to go. I'm actually going to go to Mexico next week and finish up a solo EP that I've been working on. So it's a little bit unfortunate in a way that Drag and our various solo things have been held up a bit, because I think it does make the clamour for new Nitzer Ebb stuff all the more, which I think, you know, if the Drag stuff and our various other projects are out, I think it's very obvious, although the projects are different, that it is members of Nitzer Ebb involved in all those projects. There's a flavour of it. And, just in terms of kind of creatively clearing the decks to do new Nitzer Ebb stuff, it's, until those projects are complete and out there, it's sort of like, feels like starting to read a new book before you've finished reading the current one that you're reading. We've got to get those things out. And I think there's plenty there for the Ebb fans to grab a hold of. So that's kind of important for us, is to get the other projects, see them through, to their completion, and then we can think about new Ebb stuff.
I'm looking forward to it. And just before I ask you about the tour coming up with Front 242, you recently played shows with Ministry and Nine Inch Nails. How was that?
Yeah, it was awesome.
It was good. What?
Yeah, it's great. Really good. Ministry were amazing. I mean, all the bands that played that night were great, but I hadn't seen Ministry in a few years, and they were really on point that night. Kind
of surprising that, seeing all of us have been around for so long, that none of us had ever actually played together until that night. We hadn't played, directly with Ministry or Nine Inch Nails before. So, and the fact that, we're all long established and everything else, it was nice to be able to get everyone together,
Oh, fantastic. What comes to mind when I say the name Al Jourgensen and Ministry?
Chaos. General chaos.
What about I say the word Trent Reznor? It's the first word that comes to mind.
We knew him, or Flood, really, because Flood was working with him doing Pretty Hate Machine. Yeah. So kind of like just remember him being this, just he was an up and coming artist at that point, and then it obviously came and upped.
Kind of when I think of Trent, it's actually the opposite of Al. Trent is very kind of calm, organized, very smart, sort of like they're chalk and cheese, really. One's chaos and one is stability.
That's interesting. Good comparison. Okay, guys, final question here. Have you thought about the word legacy? That's a word that, I hear a lot when you talk to people that have had long careers, successful entrepreneurs, groups, bands, whatever, musicians, creatives. 40 years of music and counting. We know you've been an influence on a lot of groups and bands over the years. We discussed that. But when all is said and done, what do you want to be remembered for? Like, what's the Nitzer Ebb legacy?
Yeah, personally, I would say just honesty and commitment. It's we've always sort of gone into everything with our heart and soul and kind of worn our hearts on our sleeve. And, you know, still to this day with the live shows, we give it everything we've got, you know, so as honestly as we can. So for me, I'd like to be remembered for that, you know, just for doing our best to be honest and fully committed to what we're doing.
At least they tried.
Yeah.
I love it. You know, it's funny. I ask that question quite often, and it's a tough one to answer sometimes when you're put on the spot for that, because you think, whoa, okay, never really thought about it, you know, but interesting perspective. Thanks so much, guys, for joining us today. So good to
Thanks, Anders, baby.
In more
Yeah.
detail, right? 4 decades of Nitzer Ebb. Looking forward to the next 40 years, guys. See what's in
Indeed.
store.